So I just handed out a little agenda to walk through. The majority of what's written on here is just a review of what happened last winter and spring for the development of the 1920 budget. So I thought that'd be good to review that before getting into the process for this coming year, the 2021 budget development process. So, again, just as a review, there was a significant amount of input collected last year, basically October through June. We had the budget work session that we did at this time last year. There were all the meetings that occurred with the 100-day plan, the Budget Advisory Committee, the Latino Parent Advisory. We had work sessions at and board meetings, the topics at those, Superintendent's Cabinet, DAC, the School Accountability Committee, so just a wide variety of input that happened last year. We summarized all that. I don't know if you remember this. This was the presentation that was attached to it where we summarized kind of the comments that were made by all the various groups. And those helped kind of feed into the development of the priorities for the budget for this year. We did sort of, not officially, but at least sort of carry forward the ideas that were adopted as priorities for the 18-19 year. That's support to close the opportunity achievement gaps with the number of sub-bullets under there, attracting, recruiting, and retaining high-quality staff, maintaining and ensuring adequate district operational functions. So those were also in the background. There was work going on with the strategic plan. In the annual plan topics that happened last year, full day kindergarten was a topic, so that was successful on multiple levels. School start times, technology conversation, social emotional learning. So all of those kind of fed into the development of this year's budget. So procedurally and process-wise, there are a lot of similar pieces built into this, the upcoming year for the 2021 budget development, but suffice it to say that there's lots of opportunity for input and gathering feedback throughout the process. I guess any questions, comments, statements about what happened last year?
I will say that within that process, your feedback was very helpful to make sure that we integrated that, and that input came in this meeting that we did in a work session about a year ago. So those talks are not close to the process. I do think that there was definitely some improvements last year. We talked about some different improvements this year. This is an opportunity to think through the process that we used, the things that you liked about last year's process, the things that there were other additional improvements where you think that the things could have done differently, and that's why we're having this.
That's a good question. If the last memo from Ernestine about the school funding finance committee indicates that there might be a change to the formula, not impacting us for this budget cycle, but maybe in the future. How are we going to incorporate that in this year's conversations?
So I can specifically address that in one of the slides that I have.
Fantastic.
It comes up actually to some extent. Anything else? Nothing else. Okay. So first, the timeline and milestones. So this was attached to the agenda item. So this is the same format that we have used for a number of years now, which is the known dates and deadlines, both associated with BVSD as well as the state structures and statute as far as when things need to happen. So first, this is intended with the little legend down in the corner, as my pointer almost works, is the idea that the opportunity for stakeholder input exists throughout the 10 months that we're talking about the next year's budget. So from right now all the way through budget adoption in June, there's numerous opportunities to engage in the process, whether it's board meetings, our parent group and stakeholder meetings, internal district staff meetings, public meetings. So there's just a lot of opportunity that exists all the way throughout. And so we want to make sure that the public understands that there are plenty of opportunities to provide input. Next, we layer on the board meetings and work sessions that exist, again, just to sort of lay the scale of when things happen. Those couple of times when we don't have 2 board meetings in a month that can impact when presentations are made or decisions have to be made along the way. Next, we layer on what we call our data input pieces. So these are everything from, I'm gonna get my larger printed one so I can read it. So the governor's budget request is the next thing that comes up on the 1st of November. Enrollment updates, current year revenue forecasts are built in there from the state, so the state knows how it's doing. If there's a slowdown occurring in the current fiscal year, that does not bode well for the next fiscal year. Open enrollment dates in there, and the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, which is the what the inflation rate is for the next year. That comes in February. And then we're getting information with the legislature. So the legislature starts on January 8th and ends on May 6th. So if the Interim Committee on School Finance is able to get together enough to make a proposal up to 5, I think they have the opportunity. Those would come forward in the legislative session. I think a number of people on that committee, I went down to not the last one, but the one before. There's some desire to change the formula, but by sort of messing with pieces of it, which I would suggest would be challenging to do. There would be a number of districts that would not be too supportive of it if you just took the existing funding within the formula and redistributed it. And a number of people on the committee, the interim committee, understand that additional resources are really necessary to make a substantive change to the School Finance Act in a meaningful way that's not really taking resources away from one district to give to another. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean,
How would we deal with it?
yeah, I mean, the last I heard, there seems like there's a slight inclination to try this out. So
The
do
two
we need
things-
to be preparing for that? Do we need to?
Oh, we're preparing for it, I would say. There's lots of conversations. that are
There's
happening.
2 things, I think you're working on one, and then there's another big position.
Right. To be clear, the uniform mill, setting the uniform mill, which is a separate conversation that potentially could generate more funds, which would lead to the easier option of changing the School Finance Act if there was more money in it. And there's a lot of conversation around setting that uniform mill levy and what the impacts are and what it gets set at, the tax policy implications. I mean, there's a lot of things that are not, while it impacts school districts, there are a lot of other conversations that are directly associated with it that are not school district specific. So, moving right along. Next we have our feedback opportunities. So these are essentially the work sessions or board meetings that are identified to where a specific budget topic is being presented. But I'm going to back up for 1 second. One thing that's not listed on here, but I wanted to mention was Proposition CC. So the outcome of that, which we'll know first week or so of November. So it specifically prohibits the use of those dollars on salaries and essentially directs them towards one-time expenditures, because the feeling was that these might not be regularly reoccurring dollars, and that constraint was built into the language. So regardless of what the outcome is of that election, it's not as directly positive to school districts from an ongoing expenditure standpoint.
Do we have an estimate of what one time we would get if it passes?
It all depends on how they split it and how much more over the Tabor limit comes in.
The split was defined, it's not.
I don't remember, is it a third?
Third. Yeah, that's what I thought.
But is it just a straight per pupil distribution? Is it get calculated some different way? I mean, there's so there's different opportunities. I'm not sure if it would be $10 million, if that's the question. So the feedback loops.
I was thinking about our last conversation, anyway.
So these are opportunities again that exist specifically. Not to say that there can't be other topics brought onto board agenda items to discuss the budget. We do have the legislative meeting with representatives that we discussed, maybe a different format or a new format for this year. We do have that listed on there. Again, that I give additional feedback from what our legislators are thinking or what we might press them to work on. Then all the way up through the proposed budget coming at the end of May. Next.
Let me ask a question on couldn't first slide. The return on investment, are we getting some information on that in terms of
I'll get to that a little bit later.
And I can just go to stop you, because in addition to these feedback sessions, our intention would be to get, again, some of these stakeholder groups to get their feedback. Right, so
Yeah,
that, you can see the advisory council.
Yeah, this is intended to be feedback from the board, specifically on the development.
So I know in that case, it's a feedback, but when we get the feedback from school leadership or the team up there in the budget, so we don't have to schedule. Maybe just have to do it. With 10 years of feedback, there's more options.
So each of these groups are meeting monthly throughout this whole time period. So
For us,
that would come through the superintendent. Similarly,
Share how we shared this last year.
right, so this little chart where we kind of took all the comments that were made about if it was investments or strategic investments or something like that, the question that was asked of everybody. And we took all the comments and sort of categorized them into these broad categories to sort of lay out where that feedback was coming of the suggested investments that we would make. So that's what happened last year. We were having the conversation about the strategic plan specifically at that point in time, so they sort of fit together well. This time around, it would be, here's the strategic plan, which is certainly more put together at this point in time than it was at last year.
We're happy to give you the raw data like that.
Individual group.
Trying to think about how we can set a session like that.
I'm just
You guys have an open community session that anyone can come to. Right, where they can come to people the whole year, so I feel like there's a lot of avenues to hear from any party who wants to, they can person to we have them to come fraud.
I would say feed that back through Rob to take it to the group.
I mean, if we're getting feedback, right, and if you wanna come in
She put us on hold.
It's like the Academy Awards.
Is Kitty on a break, or what do we?
Kitty, are you still there?
It's very pleasant.
Elevator game.
Okay, so within these dates, we have the draft strategic financial plan that will be the end of January. The second quarter mid-year financials are in there, and then of course the work session in April to review the preliminary budget, both at a work session and a regular board meeting. This one, it may not look exactly like this, but something similar to this. When did we do this? This was, I think, in April.
Kitty said she couldn't hear anyone except Bill, so she's hanging up.
Trying. So I think this was in April when we put this together. But we'll be sure to come up with some sort of feedback. So these are the action items that have been in play for certainly either by statute or just our practice. So the staffing allocations, we say February through April, although the Friday before spring break is the typical large distribution of staffing out to schools, but we're in the hiring process depending on whether it's administrators or known retirements or resignations, things like that, as early in the process as feasible to get the best candidates. Listed on here, we do have adopting strategic budget priorities. We did that 2 years ago. We didn't do it last year. It's an opportunity, not a requirement. The approval of the staffing distribution, so again, as a board action to say, yes, we're approving the distribution of staffing for that spring break timeframe. We have some reduction in force and notifications to employee groups if just that are contractual. And then, of course, the budget adoption, the deadline being the June 30th. Last year we did it at the first meeting in June. We were able to cancel that last meeting in June. So again, that timeline seems reasonable again this year, but it all depends on when things are playing out. Then we layer it all together, and it's a very busy chart, but it does try to point out the times at which we get the information that we need to act on and when the opportunities are for providing feedback from the board to the superintendent, as well as making those final actions on adopting the budget.
Is our October count still the 1 week, and is it the first week of October?
It's 5 days either side, and I think the first is a Sunday, so it falls on Monday. Like that.
And so we get that data right there.
So we submit by, I think it's November 10th, so we basically clean up the data for a month. We submit it on November 10th, and then we do in December, that meeting in December, do an enrollment update on where we landed and what things look like.
Okay, so what's your date?
The
December
10th.
10th.
Oh, is it the 2nd, I think? Is that Monday?
October
No,
2nd
that's
through the.
It is.
It's not September 30th.
Is that the Friday before?
That's a Monday.
No, maybe it's October 1st then. Unless they moved it because, is that Rosh Hashanah? Yeah, they might have moved it.
Okay.
CDE sets it.
And they're not doing it on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, right?
CDE, we don't set it, CDE sets it, and I think they moved it, which is why we got that email.
That was one of the reasons I asked, because I don't know that they did they? Well, we'll know that soon. I thought that there was an email that we received that it wasn't moved, but maybe it moved it since. Okay.
I mean, statute says October 1st, so if it's not, if that doesn't fall on a weekend, usually it happens on that day. But we have the opportunity with the window of time on each side. Process improvements. So as we are continuously trying to make things better as far as the budget development process, what we're really talking about this go around, I think, is the strategic alignment of the district investments. So we have this kind of broken down into 4 phases: educate, evaluate, inform, and implement, and they sort of cross over each other, much like the information and decisions that happen along the timeline. There are overlaps in what we have laid out here. So in the educate phase of it, in basically October through December, Cabinet will be doing a full review of the division budgets, revenues, expenditures, the staff that are associated with those budgets, the program's purpose, and the strategic alignment or operational priority, because not all areas are built into the strategic plan, but certainly there's operational priorities, health and safety and all that. Reviewing the initiative inventory, so those were all the 251 programs that we categorized, looking for opportunities there of things that may not be aligned with the strategic plan, or that are opportunities to reinvest either dollars or free up people's time to be more focused on the strategic work that needs to be done. And then the prioritization of these district strategic initiatives. So these are the new items in the strategic plan, and there is both the phasing of that as has been presented, but also just the timeline of the action plans and when those things will happen, and what needs to be resourced either in the second half of this year or going into the 2020-2021 fiscal year. Next is the evaluate phase, so November through April. So the strategic framework drives the budget priorities. The strategic initiatives are the budget priorities, so trying to refocus the conversation of strategic plan here and budget priorities over here, that really they're one and the same, that the strategic plan is driving the budget priorities. Integration of the academic return on investment concepts in the budget process. So I think this is getting a little bit to your point, Richard, that a consistent framework for a student-centric budget proposal. So what this really means is taking that framework that was used for the initiative inventory, which had a number of questions related to each of the programs of what is the target population of students, is it segmented within that population, what are the expected outcomes, what are the measurements, what are the results, there was a number of questions. Those are the big ones, aren't they, Jonathan? For the most part. Alignment with the strategic plan, and making sure that any student-centric proposals, right? So we wouldn't try to align additional custodians with expected student outcomes, but to say for programmatic areas for students, really focusing on getting those components answered so that we have something to look at going forward in the future to try to measure that results in comparison against other programs or opportunities. KPIs, key performance indicators, and benchmarks for the evaluation of operational budget proposals. So we have a conversation in a couple of weeks or so with the board on KPIs and what those mean. And so having an eye towards that from the operational side as we go into this as well. Does that answer your question? Do you have additional?
Yes, it does. I'm just thinking that if we find that there are certain programs that are not working,
So several layers within the strategic plan. 3C is our use of this process to look at programmatic areas and investments. Program evaluation is a very thorough, long process that we're building into this. So there will not be any programs evaluated in that level of detail in November to April, if that's the question. Getting all those things in place so that we can do them into the future. It's a multi-year look at something to evaluate how well it's implemented, the fidelity, all that. So there's a lot that goes into it.
That's been taking place already, hasn't it?
We started with the literacy last year. It was one of the presentations on the CBAM model. If you remember that conversation from April-ish last year.
But we needed enough data to see what's working and what's not. Is that what you're basically saying?
This is really about instilling budgeting discipline, right, to get to those answers. So on an annual basis, we know what we're going to look about and what we're looking for. And then using those results to make budgetary decisions as opposed to incremental budgeting, which is you got 500 grand last year, this year you get 500 grand, next year you get 500 grand. We need to be thinking about before we start to invest, what are we trying to accomplish and whether that's happening or not. Sometimes to Bill's point, those are multi-year efforts. We'll talk a little bit about that as we think about the metrics. Right? You do want, as we have feedback around even the strategic planning process, we need to give things time to work. Right? So we don't want to prematurely evaluate something and make decisions and push it into that for a lot of education. But this really replaces this idea of incremental budgeting at the district level within the district divisions.
Some of these programs have been going on for years.
Right. We don't know if we were or not. We'd like to think they're good. I would hope to say if we didn't think they did, we would stop doing it. Right? But having more discipline around it.
So that if one of the initiatives has to do with our allocation of resources, would we be, is this the time frame when we would have a conversation with you? Or is that a bigger change than what we're talking about?
Yeah, this is more around district level partners programs as we go back to this slide. This is more about our district investments. What you're speaking to is around maybe the weighted out formulas and allocation of people. Right? We'll obviously be looking at PBA and our other.
That's 3A of the, I think.
Which is not a phase 1 initiative. That's more a phase 2 initiative.
I should have read that more closely.
So, I mean, to that point, it would be nice when budgets are brought forward if we could see how the programs, like the layout in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, how the union contract goes out 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and see how that all goes out.
So that's good. So, like if it's a multi-year investment, right, to be laying out that multi-year investment as opposed to
Putting this money in here's what impact spending.
But to be fair, we have had that for some programs and initiatives.
I mean, as a total roll up with everything.
And we appreciate that we can predict our costs, but we can predict our expenditure, our revenue.
right.
Again, that's just the way it is.
Yeah, that's true.
Inform is the next phase. So this is really, when the decision making starts to happen. We're getting data and information around our funding levels, legislative impacts that may occur, those prioritized strategic initiatives, what needs either time or dollars invested in the next fiscal year, and then reprioritization of existing programs and activities. This is looking at, are there things that could be put on pause or just taken off the table altogether. As I was talking about, and Jonathan can speak to this way more length than I can, but the process of program evaluation is not something you do on a program that is $50,000. It'll take that much effort to go through the evaluation of it. So at some level, there's just a decision that will have to be made on some of these 251 things that won't necessarily have a full evaluation done on them. Stakeholder input and feedback, again, this is when we would typically be scheduling those community meetings, parent group meetings, staff meetings with the specific topic of the budget or strategic priorities. Those tend to happen in that February to May timeframe.
Would it be possible to have the middle school and high school student feedback session in this time frame as well? Or I think it was April last year. Remember we have a student advisory committee for the middle school and high school levels.
Yes, who's in charge?
Last year.
Right,
When was that? Do you remember? I feel like it was kind of late spring.
this was in the spring, yeah.
Did they talk about the budget at all?
But it was more about
You want them to?
student feedback just on
These things that are happening.
learning. I mean, it might be nice to hear the students involved just in case something.
I think that that's just dependent upon the timeline that Mike Hill has with those kids.
Yeah, it's
And
not
they
a
work
big-
on annual projects and they kind of do the timeline.
We're gonna have students at the Catholic time.
Yes.
They don't.
Thanks,
We
Richard.
have to go.
Come on.
We have a new board.
So specific to the students, if they're working on an annual kind of conversation, getting that in front of them for the next year would be a good idea as well, so they're ready for it and able to deal with it. Implement March through August, so this is of course when we're distribution of staffing, balancing of the budget to the extent that that needs to be done, rolling out those strategic initiatives and any other school supports that might get built into the
I'm
budget.
thinking that at CASB, we could start getting some earlier input from students.
So next steps, so the finalization of these phase one strategic initiatives, so they are kind of lined out, but the more detailed action plans and what activities or investments of time and dollars would need to happen. The October count, which will give us some good information on the direction of enrollment. And then, of course, the revised budget will bring in January for adoption. So in December, I'll bring back the milestones. That's our typical presentation, again in December that we do that, and updated with any new information that might come along.
So I know that we usually have like about $10 million that we have to fight over. What did we get last year? Yeah, 8?
It was up there, it was,
I remember fighting over it.
I don't remember fighting over it, but I remember that was the number.
I don't know who was.
Priorities.
What's that? I would say we're makes this coming year very different than last year, because we do have a strategic plan based initiative that are aligned with the long-term outcomes we're trying to achieve. I think in Bill's presentation, you know, this idea that we have to invest in our strategy, right? Now, obviously, we'll have conversations or there's other community priorities and things that have to be. I know that there's collective priorities and there's individual priorities and board members. I think that's the case for any school board in the country, right? So we'll continue to have those conversations. But I don't want to lose the point that moving forward as we think about our strategic initiatives and our strategic plan, that those have to become collective priorities.
Multi-year conversations, those are something that with the elementary counselors, that was really about the first time that we ever brought in a program and phased it in over multiple years. The other investments, capital investments, what those look like over multiple years, that can be a conversation to the extent that saying that this is going to happen, whatever this is, in 2020 or 2021 or 2022, gives that ability to build it into the process, start setting aside dollars if there needs to be something built up over time, or be planning for that in some number of years out to either look at redistributing resources, things like that, but take it out of the spring conversation, which makes it very difficult to take something away, so to speak. That it's not about cutting the budget, but again reprioritizing. And if you can have that conversation over multiple years, it makes it a little bit easier.
What do you think will be, because I know that you might be reprioritizing small programs that aren't going to come to the board and appropriately won't come to the board, but from terms of our perspective, how different will the budget allocations look this year, do you think? Or do you think that we may not notice it so much because those changes will be at a lower level?
Yes.
I think it's hard to answer that question. I mean, Bill has laid out a thorough and deep process that our entire campus will do. Right. And so, in past years, if I had $500,000, what I did it from one year to the next, that really wasn't. Folks were reinvesting and investing in spending money for kids. So I think we need to go through that process. Is there the opportunity that we're going to take some of these dollars and reinvest them into strategic initiatives? I think it's important. Right? To Richard's point, there's new money, whether it's one time or recurring dollars. I think that those are decisions that we have to make based on our priorities, based on the conversations and feedback that we get through the community. We have to continuously thinking, it's not like this point we're going to go kind of highlight this idea that potentially as we look at enrollments, projections, we need to look into more of a reserve to be able to prepare for that. And you do that over time. You can do that in a year because then it becomes a crisis and we plan accordingly. And we can adjust staffing, adjust the things that we do, and also involve them as well. But we can have those conversations.
We will probably slip into averaging this year. Because
Sorry,
we've
what
been
is that?
Averaging, so when we go to define.
Right.
so because we're relatively very flat over a period of time, any dip pushes us into averaging. I think we did last year, actually, to a very small
That's what
extent,
I thought.
just a smidge.
Can I ask an enrollment question? So if I compare this year's number at the elementary level to last year's number, how is the counting of full-time kindergartners affecting our enrollment? These are the enrollment counts we get every day or every week. So when I look at compare kindergarten numbers, am I looking at half kids or whole kids year by year?
The
0.6
enrollment
kids.
numbers are always heads.
So those numbers were always heads anyway.
Yeah.
They weren't FTE.
Correct.
Fantastic.
The overall elementary is projected to be down from last year, or down from the projection. I don't remember if we projected it to be exactly flat or up, but kindergarten is higher than what we projected.
Right. But everything else is down.
Yes.
So
Or
it probably still
projected.
keeps it a little, so it probably still keeps it a little flat. One's up, one's down.
It would be down about, if given 2 years, if this year is like the last average 2 years, we'll be down about 250 kids from projection.
Overall. So right now, increasing enrollment is not a strategic initiative.
How would you do it?
We're doing that with sorts of creative ways, I think, but I think got some ideas and it's working, sharing it. It's just that I know, working in corporate finance, you can get into just this mode of cutting because you're losing revenue, and it's, the end game is not good. So at some point, you need to look at how you can increase revenue, not just cut costs.
And with that said, contract negotiations, when they come around, they will impact some of, decisions made towards strategic planning.
I think all of our contracts are in multi-year agreements, so finances are the only piece that's open this next year.
I think the having more MultiYear Conversations is a great idea. But I would also observe, and I don't know if you share this, over the 8 years that I've been on the board, I think the process has improved, and in some ways significantly, in terms of the timeline and the opportunities for input. So, we're moving in the right direction.
We didn't have budget conversations in September before last year.
The good old days.
Anything else, or shall we conclude? All right, only 5 minutes late.
Anybody need a few minutes? We're doing a.
Yeah, strategic,
Oh, sorry.
there you go.
Slide 15.
Yeah.
Sorry to present.
Go back. Find out where you wanna get to and then.
Right.
Kind of
That buys us
important
time.
there.
Which buys us time.
Right.
There's just really, I have
Yeah.
less revenue. So they probably just need to work on that. I don't think it's this. Oh, it's not. Correct. I think we need to advocate for the audience.
What's that?
Shouldn't be this. That shouldn't be.
All right, my mistake, I thought we were done.
I know, I wonder what you
I'm not gonna lie to you, I screwed it up, but here we are. So good to hear you.
So welcome, Jonathan. We're here to discuss our long-term outcome metrics. Jonathan is going to do just some review with you all. We talked about this at the end of spring, I believe in May. Last time we had some proposed metrics that would align with our long-term outcomes. You all have given us some suggestions on those measures. Jonathan will present those and then also do some presenting on how those metrics do align with the 6 phase 1 strategic initiative that we have queued up for this year, and then also potential impact on our long-term outcomes and measures of some significant work that we did over the summer that we're actually taking on this year, and then having just some conversations around next steps and the alignment of initiative implementation and then metric improvement expectation. That makes sense. Jonathan, did I kick it off for you?
You did very much. Thank you, Rob, President Marquis, members of the board, Dr. Anderson. You've just heard an overview of what we're going to be talking about here, and here is exactly it. To launch in, we are at the end of the planning part of this improvement planning phase. Much input gathered on the way, feedback on what the plan looked like, how we worded pieces of it, and we're now talking again about the monitoring process that we last talked about on, might have been June 11th around these initiatives, which you heard from CMS at least once around that time and since then about this, right? These are initiatives about what we teach, how we use resources, how we monitor what we have, the partnerships we have, and how we are as a community. These are focused on our long-term outcomes, right? Which we've vetted. So we have these, and now what we do is we try to get into the particulars of how we set specific metrics under these. At our last time we talked about that, we did talk about wanting to make sure these measures were well aligned, related to the outcomes, that we could measure them effectively, right, over time, and both in the precisions we did with, but also that they promoted positive accountability. They were around opportunity growth and achievement, and that they avoided incentivizing some counterproductive actions. Even when this might mean we might get a little geeky in choosing a metric that's just so instead of the one that's easier to explain. Sometimes the one that's easier to explain has consequences that we really don't want. So as we think now about these being implemented, right, we want to remind ourselves of the implementation considerations that Bill alluded to earlier around CBAM, right? The concerns-based adoption model, which is the way we talk about when something is implemented in education. How does that look over time? Well, first, it's at different pace for the different individuals who are implementing it. When you first implement something new, particularly in a complex activity like teaching, you might be mechanical about it. And positive effects you might not necessarily see the first time around. We hope to avoid implementation dip, but that does occur. Once we become more skillful, right, then we have the expectation of improved outcomes according to the outcomes we expected from the measure, from the new strategy we chose in the first place, right? And that we expect that in proportion to how aligned these are, our measures are with these strategies, right? You don't see math growth typically from a language arts strategy. You might hope for a little bit, but that's not your main thing. But you also expect to see it more in classrooms and buildings that use the strategies effectively. So here is the revised list of the metrics that we have. The revisions are, one, we've tightened up the language a little bit on some of these to make sure about that we're referring broadly to post-secondary outcomes and not college only. But also we've added, and do I have the thing here? Oh yes, we've added some language here at the bottom based on the advice you had about saying we wish to see something in here explicitly for emerging bilinguals and students in special education, so that we do have growth there, showing as one of the metrics we would look at. You see again, this is the same list we're talking to, organized around these themes. We're going to dive into these in much more detail, though, as we think about the impact that we have associated with these. Now, this is a little speculative, right, to say what the impact will be. But when I think about, and we take these in reverse order, when I think about the culturally responsive practices we're going for, those are meant to have a dark green kind of big impact around school climate. That should make it, that should be the metric, the area in which we see things. So we have strategies going on around bullying. We should expect over time that when we ask students about bullying, that they indicate that's happening less often. The light green color for all the others though, point to our sense of these culturally responsive practices as enabling conditions for doing good work with students and reaching everybody. It's in reaching everybody that we have the chance to do the other work, though sometimes principally through some other strategies that we have. This isn't necessary foundational work, right? And we go on to the next one.
What kind of climate survey are we using now?
So the one that we have is the one we've had the last year and piloted the year prior to that. It's a national one, so we have a national benchmark. It's from AIR, the Association for Institutes of Research. And there's a 5th through 12th grade version of it that we have good national benchmark data, and there's a 2nd, 3rd, and 4th upgrade version of it.
We moved away completely to that one we used to do that had like 100 questions on it. Remember we did that for years.
Yeah, it had the answers that were no when they meant yes. Sentences were negatives.
We had items that were easy to answer if you were the particular student, not as easy to interpret if you're the adult looking at those scores. On these surveys, you always end up asking questions about whether or not you've been bullied. The answer, no, I haven't been bullied, is your preferred answer, but if you phrase things as favorable responses, you have to basically flip that. So all of these kinds of surveys will have some kind of asterisk in the interpretation. They're not as hard for students, but for adults to use, they reflect genuine. Every time we use it again, we have to relearn that. So,
How, like, front-end, so that we can measure them, they're under career and technical education internships, what's the metric for measuring those?
We will need to measure the number of students who are having internships. Right? So some of these data are the data that we don't have now or we don't have accurately now. But but we would be broadening what we collect in order to look at this over time.
Where does it say?
Internships is the bottom of this right here, right? So
We wanted to, with this, I think the thought is that we wanted to further define advanced coursework and make sure that that some of our work-based opportunities were to the public, so the public understood we consider that advanced coursework, right? And a challenging and relevant educational opportunity.
Yeah, probably not.
Well, I think the first is to set baselines on how many kids actually think today, right? And then the baselines are probably in those areas not going to be where we want to be. Let's be honest, right? And then it sets as a target and as a focus as we move forward, especially as we think about our initiatives within our strategic plan. How because these are outcomes, right? Like this is if that's what the outcome we want.
Is there a way to ask when we take career, opportunities that we don't provide? Is there a way to find out?
I think that comes with the action plan.
Let me discuss at the advisory committee meeting that we're having soon.
There was just a meeting about providing an opportunity about building in space. and you know, they're looking forward to what else can we do. I thought that was cool.
Do we currently have internships?
Yeah.
Metrics.
Yeah, and
I mean, you know, yes, to the extent that we should.
If there's that opportunity right now.
well, and they might be based more on a particular school, right? New Vista has the senior year Wednesday afternoon thing where you're in the community working. That would in my book count as an internship or whatever they call it. That's what we can measure.
But don't you think that we should have some kind of standard in terms of an internship?
That's the work of the strategic initiative. Like so when you set metrics, some of these metrics are going to be pretty, some are going to be ugly. But as we think about where we want to be in the future, right? Like you have to have a baseline and understand how your growth moves forward. But all of these things do have relation to our strategic initiative. So I'll ask Jonathan to kind of keep moving.
And real quick, in our 18 to 21 program, we had internships that we measured how many of the companies out there brought them in, some hired and some not. And after they had their internship, they would go on to be hired.
So internships falls under some of the things we think are going to be impacted by partnerships, right? They're things that partnering with the right folks can offer us. So put that as one of the pieces that we think there'd be some influence from, right? So the partnerships work ought to have some impact there. We talk about academic return on investment. I believe the focal point of that work is going to be around interventions and our main instructional activities. So we focused more on reducing disparities. That said, there will be opportunities to evaluate and help improve practices over time. Though the linkage I see, but is evidenced by the dark green here, right, is more in that area than it is in the others. The resource allocation system work that's just starting and being talked about, as I understand that work, so this is a little bit more basically speculative since it hasn't happened yet, right? It is focused on reducing disparities, and it is focused on allocating resources in ways that will help close gaps. You could probably argue about whether there's some light green that ought to be in other areas, but this is the main focus, as I understand the work. Next to last, the what we teach and how we teach. That work is, I believe, focused on reducing disparities and attaining postgraduate success as a foundational piece, right? It will influence the other things that we have, and to the extent your climate survey asks, as ours does, questions about how engaged students are in class, how much the learning relates to the real world for them, and those strategies appear in 1B, the how we teach piece. We would expect some alignment there also.
How are we measuring post-secondary enrollment in the systems that we're in now?
We are in the process of getting the DPA signed by the National Clearinghouse, and then we'll have more complete data. Otherwise, the data that we have is GD's data on matriculation.
And that's enrollment, we don't have any data on persistence.
We don't.
Don't we have the mediation that's just for the CU feeders? Isn't that what it is? We can tell how many kids had to get remedial work done at CU right now.
Yep.
And we have that by high school graduate.
But that's different from persistence, right?
Yeah. But I think that's a good one too.
National Clearinghouse data is the place where you're able to measure this. When you think about persistence, you say who gets enrolled and who's enrolled for a second, right? You start to think about, how are our programs not only preparing kids to enroll to get into college, right? And I think there's good evidence to say that today, but how are they sticking in college, right? And then what can we learn from that as we backwards map what's happening? So I think it's a different piece of data that we haven't looked at in the past, but I think it's really telling.
There's really no way to know if we don't go to college and find a history certificate out what happens.
Unless we do postgraduate surveys to try to track these kids down.
Did we do anything with our colleges that's off track? But there are colleges that have good success rate of graduating from apples populations and other ones. Remember the DSS takeouts that we had in Charles and Hutchins and colleges that have high success rates?
I think if we do is at an individual school level, it's a systemic issue. You'd be surprised how many kids get accepted and never show up. Like they just don't show up. Especially our kids in poverty, especially our kids who are first generation college kids. They get in, they celebrate, they go to their graduation, and then what it takes to go from there, housing, to get everything set up, they don't have somebody that's going to drive them to college instead of them. There's a pocket of kids who get in and never show up. And I think that being able to put a light on that to see how to support those kids to make sure they get there is
It's a lot like the research that says you really need to hold in your because it's such a huge transition. They're kind of dropping the ball on that.
Well, what DSST does is this is what they told us, I don't know if it's all true, but they know which colleges are good at doing that, and so they encourage their kids to apply those colleges and not to the colleges that have very low graduation rates for kids that bachelor programs. It's kind of, it's a pretty good idea from my perspective, so you don't even have to go through that process if the college doesn't have a good track record. But yeah, I'm sure it's all money. Yeah, go ahead.
The only thing I see there is elementary school is math. So the only thing I'm measuring about success is the I think that's just challenging.
I be asking about school climate, don't we? It's about climate. And what are other things today that we can measure? I think is the challenge there.
Well, I think we need to do a better job, because I know a lot of kids that are not doing very well with CMAS, but yet they do better when they finish high school. And it really depends on the schools that they've been going to. But they have huge success rates, in terms of what they do.
So we're measuring climate, advanced coursework that applies in elementary, growth, achievement. They are tested, growth within certain populations. I think that's something that I know is a priority, right? But outside of the school climate survey, which we have data for a couple of years, what are you thinking, Kathy, in regards to another measurement, some social emotional learning measurement, some other measurement of achievement? We want to look at grades. We want to look at what are the things that we measure today that we can look at that would relate to success, not aligned to success.
Well, it's that whole, as we talked about, the whole opportunity gap measure.
So the schools of opportunity. Is there one or two that you want us to, or you want us to investigate before we move forward? Is everybody familiar with what Kathy's referring to?
I don't want to avoid this conversation. And have somebody new come in and have a conversation. Let people have an opportunity to look at it.
I think it's important.
I know one of the indicators on equity gap is parent involvement, along with even teacher involvement with parents and connectedness there. So I don't know exactly how you would measure that, but some sort of progress monitoring in that area.
So this is a working document, right? We can proceed with these, but we can also begin to explore those other measures, especially at the elementary school level, around those other ideas. And as we're thinking about moving forward, board members, how would you want us to proceed in that regard? Would you want us to get some information first on what it is that we're speaking to, and then we could have another conversation?
That one that says what we teach, how we teach, but I don't see, something around relationships, maybe.
I guess we would think that would show up in the school climate survey.
We hope it would.
Well, and we would also say that some of that, right, is gonna be in this idea about culturally responsive practices. So it isn't that the how we teach, it isn't going to include really engaging methods, but some of our engagement really is around practices that are, and maybe I've made my shorthand a little too short here, right? Maybe this how we teach is the right way to say it.
Do we still put out a parent survey?
We do.
Did we consider, I know that you don't get great response, did we consider using that as a measurement around the parent partnership, or is that too difficult to do?
Well, I mean, we absolutely can. We just know that it's taken by about a quarter of folks, which isn't terrible for a modern survey.
Okay.
But we just need to know what it is we're looking at that. In the past, in some really long time ago, we have measured such thing as elementary conference attendance. It's been a long time since we've measured that. It's a very, very high number. But in the fall, changes in spring, different kind of thing. I'm sorry, Richard.
No, I was gonna say, when you do that, when was the last time we did that? Last year, parent survey?
Yes, the parents' survey was last spring.
Is it possible for us to get a survey? Sure. I'd like to see what questions are being asked. I haven't seen it. Because there's been a lot of work done with the Latino population recently, and I'm wondering if all that work has paid off.
How would you know for sure? What would you know?
Well,
Other
well, I
than
don't
the
know,
same
I don't
as
know,
work.
I don't know whether you disaggregate the parent surveys or not.
We do.
So if you have a low number last year, this year,
I just like this, I don't know how to answer your question, Rob, but I'm not comfortable having, I mean, like, we don't know if there's multiple measures for testing other than just a single score of a sequence. And to me, having multiple measures of assessment is important.
And assessment is one of our issues. It's just not feasible. Right, so I hear what you're saying. I would say that as we talk about, as people in this community pound on the table around the gaps that we're dealing with, it does deal with CMS, right? And so we want to be able to report out on that as an accountability metric, because that is the measure that the majority of citizens in this community look to, right? Is that the best way to measure growth? Is that the best way to measure achievement? I think there's better ways. I think as we think about creating an assessment system, that's going to come, but you can't do a great assessment system until you have 1A and 1B, what we teach, how we teach, and then multiple modes of assessment to be able to measure that. So here's what I would propose we do. So I think this evolves over time, right? You know, it was clear board direction that we want to set metrics, right? And so we have some things that we know might not be perfect, but we feel with confidence that these are things that we can report out and start measuring right away. There are other things, as I look at the schools of opportunity work, that I think would be really interesting. One that I know that we've talked about publicly, more and better learning time during the school year and summer. Right? How many kids are we engaging in that? I think that's really going to be important for us. You know, a variety of assessments designed to respond to needs.
One of them is supporting different professions.
Right. So
So here's my only pushback, Rob. Yes, the public is used to looking at single scores, but we have learned over 15 years or however long since we've been in NCD that single test scores don't tell us what's going on in the school. And so it's supposed to perpetuate the participation in single test scores is the measure of time activities perpetuate that year. And then help us.
So I would say that these metrics are designed to tell us what's going on. I would say that this is part of the metrics that really are hoped to be aligned and designed to see how we're doing in reaching our 3 long-term outcomes, which is challenging development, educational opportunities, reducing disparities, and postgraduate success. So to your point, as these things align to those, I think we can continue to have conversations and begin to evolve what is like a metrics dashboard, right? Or we can stop altogether if that's what the board would like for us to do, and we can start from scratch. We want to get this right. We want to respond. You know, we don't want to move forward with something that you all don't support.
I'm not suggesting to stop, but I'm suggesting we have a conversation with our community about what we would like to know about what's going on in the schools other than this course.
I think that if we do that, we need to come up with what it looks like, because our community does only look just like. And when they talk about the achievement gap, they're talking about outcomes that are reported in the daily camera by the CBE, and especially if someone goes on the public such. So I think that we can have that conversation, but since people don't really know what are the other things out there, I think we need to be really clear on what that would look like before we go solicit feedback.
I'm fine with getting a range of options, and I get that this is changing the way we think about schools, but it has not worked for me about the way this work. So I would like to just think, if we come up with things that we can present to the public, is this something you want to know, is that something that you want to know, is this important to you, is it not?
Over time, but the one thing I do like about the metrics that we're looking at here is that they're outcome-based and activity-based. And I would say my biggest criticism in the last 6 years was that our outcomes were in fact activities that didn't have outcomes attached to them. It doesn't mean they'd be test-based, but I like the idea that we also have an outcome attached to the activities that we're doing.
And Kathy, I see it as just one of many. I know that's in the middle, but there's a lot of other things listed up there that we are basing our,
Not for elementary school, but the whole outside, I guess, I know it's postgraduate success, but if you look at reduce disparities, it's tested.
And I will say, and I will remind you all that our strategic plan is based on small community. We're very intentional. We did deep engagement, right? Where in schools, in communities, there was tons of opportunity. We took very seriously the feedback that we got from our Healthy Summit, very seriously, and those things shaped our plan, right? So I'm sensitive to what Kathy is saying, and I'm also sensitive to what Tina is saying, and what everybody is saying. Like this, I'm not saying, this is a set of metrics that will let you know how these things are working and going, but they're not comprehensive. And I do think that there's room for improvement. And that's why we have these in work sessions. These aren't presentations where I'm telling you this is final. That's what the nature of a board work session is. And so we can continue to have this conversation. I guess what my recommendation would be is moving forward with this as a phase one, right? Let's get that feedback. We can even bring some exclusive opportunity, and we can bring that as a conversation topic to DAC and see what they think on that as well. And then let's bring something back to you.
Yeah, just one last point. When I talk with Latino parents, they do care about the achievement scores, but they also care about wanting to know how their kids are doing in school, socially and emotionally. Because they want to know when they go to parent-teacher conferences, for example, the first question they ask is, "How's my kid doing?"
Right.
They're not saying, "How well is my kid reading?" "How's my kid doing?"
Not
So-
necessarily.
You're right. But I think somehow we need to start thinking about how do we measure that? How do,
I would say we do have a climate survey that I keep going back to that should capture some of those things. And these are measures that we have, right? Like if in some of the work of schools of opportunity, some of what you're suggesting we would have, there would be an increased cost of focus groups where you're doing an inspectored model where you're bringing in teams of folks to evaluate what's happening in individual schools across the district. Those are things that we can speak to certainly. But as it stands today, when I say, hey Jonathan, the next thing you're going to do is start to put numbers in here. Like we have to have things that at the beginning of the presentation that have valid, reliable, undisputable. So that's kind of why we're where we're at with these items.
Yeah,
So-
I don't really just want to slow this down. I think this is a good conversation to have, but say let's Tina said, finally progress goals rather than process goals. So that's an oversimplification, but I know where you're coming from on that, and I'm really happy to see these. So I don't think it's an either or. We can continue to have a richer conversation about some other metrics, but personally I would like to see us go with these to start.
no, I get it,
Yeah.
and I think this is good. But when I see reduced disparities, I want to see, for example, you have enrollment in advanced coursework, blah 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 blah. I want to see reducing disparities between Latino kids that are not taking advanced coursework, et cetera. And, how do we? That's what I want to see.
Me too.
Does
You're
everyone,
looking at in that column, right?
What's that?
That's exactly what you're looking at in that column.
Right.
One thing I might just throw in there is that, in companies now, there's been a movement for several years towards something called a balanced scorecard, which you may have heard.
Yep.
And that's really what we're talking about here, is like you don't measure just profit in a company, you measure sustainability efforts, workplace culture, all these different things that are important to you. And I think you're doing all that, but maybe some sort of like project system or something where you entitle what those things are, like climate,
Sure.
academic achievement or something, and then list the metrics under that, so it looks like it's balanced, because it is balanced. It's
Right.
just not displayed in a way that people can see that it's balanced.
Okay. I think that's good feedback. The other I will remind you all that in October we're going to have another conversation around a whole other set of measures, KPIs around things that we do within our district that wouldn't necessarily align here, but they're metrics that show performance and improvement, right? Which is also a balance of our performance overall.
And to that point, John, we are so far behind other states because lots of other states, California, Texas, Ohio, and small, have that kind of dashboard of information for people to go and look at, and we don't. And so I'm totally supportive of starting to try to get that, and we don't have any. To your point, Rob, we don't have any good way to figure down measure. We're so far behind, we can just borrow what other states are doing to figure this out.
What they're doing right now is really the nuts and bolts of the balanced scorecard. It's
It's
just,
a part
I'm
of it,
talking
I
about the
agree.
display of what you're doing.
Yeah,
You
and
know,
all I'm saying is we could look at what other states have done to
say what
agree
their
with you.
categories are or whatever.
And as the conversation among superintendents in the state is evolving. I was in a meeting last week that I shared with you all. We have Senate Bill 204, which is an opportunity that we'll be investigating and moving forward and actually trying to meet some other districts around this idea of the state performance frameworks just being test driven and not looking at some of these other things, right? And so there's an overall conversation that's happening. I think that some of these things could end up on something like that, and there might be even other things beyond that where we do reach out to our community and say, what's important to you all? Again, I would say that we did capture some of that as we went out and spoke to all of these folks that we spoke to around the strategic plan. But good conversation. I think that I've got clear direction. Don't stop, but always try to make it better.
So,
I've gotta.
does anyone else I realize that I don't think I've seen the school climate survey in a while, or if I did, I forgot it.
I can't visualize it. you
I
know.
can't visualize it, so could we send it to the board just so that we understand what that looks like?
We can do that, sure.
And I apologize if we sent this 6 months ago.
That's okay. It's only been used for, this is the second year? Is that right?
This is,
And it's prototype.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then this was the first year that all schools were in, correct?
Right.
I think so, yes. That was absolutely what I said, and now
Yes.
if we figure out if it was accurate.
Are we the charter school?
If a charter wishes to participate in it, they participate. If they don't, they don't. Only to say that the last things you've been looking at have been multi-year pieces, right? This is the more immediate work that's happening now, right? The reorg work that you heard about, and you've heard about multiple times, I think now, is about reducing disparities, and has implications in other areas also. Same thing around materials and literacy, as well as for the kindergarten and the University of Virginia partnership. We're focused on Columbine and Sanchez. So
So we share this with you in the sense that we feel like that these things that we've got will have quicker impacts than some of the strategic initiatives because we're still in the planning phases of strategic initiatives. Like I don't want to give you a bunch of metrics and then say, yeah, we have these metrics, but you're gonna have to wait 4 years, to see the results. Like we don't want to play that record again. We feel like that these things will have impacts, and they'll have impacts on some of these as soon as this year.
So, we'll be taking.
So the full day kindergarten, I mean, we're gonna have to wait a few years before we really start seeing any impact on that.
Well, if you pass your
Well,
we're
we have
still-
it already.
Right, we absolutely do have other measures we can use, and that's the possibilities that we have here, in addition to measuring other process measures, opportunity measures, we have the other possibility too. So, we'll be taking this work to DAC, we're planning in October, and as we think about targets, right, we have to think about alignment and then picking these goals in a manner that pays attention to the time at which some of this work will happen. As we've said, some of this is happening right now. Other pieces will begin a couple of years after the work is done to make all the right documents and give people the right training.
So are we just gonna do this in a presentation back or are we going to see school opportunity or dashboard or other things?
So what would you all propose? We're happy to bring you know, DAC does have a limited time frame. I think that we want to certainly get feedback on the things that we have. I think that's the direction that you want us to make sure that the things that we're dealing with, that we would want them to have a say. We can certainly open up the conversation. Jonathan and I can think about how we bridge some of the schools of opportunity, but not limited to schools of opportunity, right? What are some other things that we might want to look at? And DAC, we're lucky that our DAC is a pretty data savvy group, so sometimes if you get into a group of people and you ask them, well, what do you want to see? They come up with measures that would be impossible to measure, right? The things that you can't necessarily quantify to a measure, that you could evaluate and assess and report out in some different ways. But if we're talking about metrics, that can be valuable. So luckily we have DAC to consider that. I'll meet with Nicole and DAC leadership and bridge the conversation and kind of get the feedback on how they think that would work best. And the sentiment I'll share from the board is that the board likes the fact that these are more student outcome based versus, you know, checking off lists of things we've done or not done. But that there's also more to be desired because we don't want to be limited to test scores and we want to get community on what it is that we feel like we're doing that measure. And I just think that work is going to be an ongoing conversation.
I was worried about just giving this, they don't know the ask unless they can tell them the way possible.
They actually,
Yeah.
they are pretty.
That might be, but I'm just
I
suggesting
hear
you can contain that by saying, here's what I'm saying, here's what we think we know. I get frustrated because you say, well, we can't just ask them everything. I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that we have a measured additional conversation other than what's appearing. It seems to be missing.
We can do that.
Here's the parent-teacher conferences that I had. I did have lots of parents, and from the ESL learners, and the parents would come in. And Richard, to your point, not to in a different category, but they wanted to know where their kids were doing in comparison to the whole in the academics. And so I didn't get a lot of questions on so much social emotional. I did get a lot of questions on and if I said they're doing well, they're reading, yes, but in comparison to the other kids in the room. You know, they wanted to know where they fell. And I think sometimes the progress monitoring tools that we have available with the teachers in the specific classrooms are a good answer that we can give to parents.
I hear you. You know, in my 40 years of working with families and what we've done with teacher conference, you don't just ask, how's my child doing? You ask the hard questions, how's my child doing? Reading, that kind of stuff.
No, and Donna, being a parent especially, the progress monitoring is very helpful.
I started using graphs and charts to show exactly where they started and where they were now and where they needed to be. So I really got good response, just saying.
I shared a strategy that we use with parents, with Rob, where classroom teachers would actually bar graph the kids where they're at, where they should be, and where they fall. They wouldn't have any identification in terms of the kids. They would have numbers. The parents would have the number of the child, and the parent could see where her child was at compared to the rest of the classroom kids.
Exactly.
And we're talking about a wake-up call.
That sounds really uncomfortable.
No, but parents wanted to
You're the only
know.
one that's going to know.
They wanted to know though where they needed to be at this stage in life, because as our reading continuum goes, it will show what the continuum should look like. And if your child is down here, but in 3 months they've made almost a year's progress because you've intervened with a strategy that's working. Anyway.
But that process, by the way, was developed in Arizona, Creighton Elementary School.
It's where I first taught, not
And it's best
Creighton,
practice now in
Yeah.
terms of what schools are doing.
One was Deer Valley Elementary.
All right, what other questions? We have some direction, I think, that Rob's gonna go to DAC and incorporate something about different types of measurements and provide a little information behind that, so it's not a total free-for-all. I mean, it is a free-for-all, but also so that, because people may not be familiar what is
We can
even
do that.
being, what's even out there. Does that sound right, everyone? So people have ideas for festivities around the last meeting for Shelley and Sam? We're starting to pull this together.
When is that?
December 3rd.
December 3rd.
What, Shelley, I sent you an email.
She said the event is festivity.
You can't take away her
I'm just gonna kiss them all goodbye.
So,
Don't let the door hit ya.
Wilson. If I were singing, you'd be going.
You know, actually discussions like this, like I could almost
I guess we're finally something.
chart the outcome. Not, I mean, I'm perhaps exaggerating, but I, you know.
Productive day.
does feel kind of direct.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and I know it's not see tomorrow. It's
Around the back. I've approved it with all 3 counties.
Make sure to put that
Welcome. Good night.